Hi there. Welcome to another online video lesson intended to provide you important principles and helpful tips in the study and practice of argumentation. This is the sixth and final video in a series on reasoning prototypes. In this video, we're going to look at the final example of a type of argument that falls under the category of substantive warrants, according to Brock, Reagan, and Enninger. This is the prototype of figurative analogy. We'll define what we mean by a figurative analogy and contrast it against another form of argument that's pretty similar. We'll look at some example arguments to analyze them and see how figurative analogies operate in practice. And we'll go over the tests for evaluating figurative analogies to determine whether or not the use of the analogy is logically sound in a given case. Now, to get started, though, we need to review a bit from our last video in the series in order to provide an important distinction, because the word analogy gets used a lot when we're talking about public arguments, but often as referring to different types of arguments. And so we want to make sure that we tease that out. In our previous video, we looked at argument from parallel case. According to Brock, Reagan, and Enninger's 1960 article, they define it as follows. The warrant that the instance reported in the data bears an essential similarity to a second instance in the same category. In other words, to be a bit more straightforward, this is what Inch and Tudor define as a literal analogy argument. In this kind of argument, we compare two objects of the same class that share many characteristics, and we conclude that a known characteristic that one possesses is shared by the other. So this form of parallel case argument, or literal analogy, looks a little bit like this, if you remember that example from our last video. Let's say that someone is arguing that Dr. Klein's political communication class that's offered in the fall is going to be amazing. And the data that they provide for that argument is that Dr. Klein's current argument and advocacy class is amazing, and he's offering the political communication class in the fall. The implied warrant for a parallel case argument is that what's true for one member of a class, in this case, courses offered by Dr. Klein in the University of Missouri's Department of Communication, what's true for one member of that class is going to be true for another member of that class. So argument and advocacy and political communication are both courses offered by Dr. Klein in Mizzou's Department of Communication. So what's true for one class is going to be true for the other. And the backing for this particular example is that it's the same professor, same approach to course design and assignments, so on and so forth. So in a parallel case, we're comparing two similar things that belong to the larger class of objects. And what's true for one thing is going to be true for another thing because they're sufficiently similar and so they share characteristics. Now, it's often the case that this kind of argument from parallel case gets the general label of analogy slapped onto it. And it's okay as far as it goes. But there's more than just literal analogies out there, and that's what this lesson is going to be focusing on. According to Brock, Reagan, and Enninger, they distinguish analogy from parallel cases in the following way. In an argument from analogy, the data report that a relationship exists between two items. The warrant assumes that a similar relationship exists between a second pair of items. And they clarify that this kind of reasoning assumes only a similarity of relationship, not a similarity between the two cases. So we're not comparing two things. We're comparing two relationships. Now, this can feel a little opaque. So Inch and Tudor's definition of a figurative analogy gets a little bit more concrete. What we have is a comparison between two objects of different classes in which a relation or quality within one is said to be similar to a relation or quality within the other. Okay, so this tells us a little bit more. We know that the comparison that we're making involves things that don't belong to the same class. In the previous example of a parallel case argument, we were comparing two things that were similar because they belong within that larger class of items. In a true analogy, we are not comparing similar objects. We're comparing relationships or qualities that exist between objects that are very dissimilar. Now, this can seem even more confusing. So let's go to an example to determine what exactly they're talking about here. An arguer presents the following data. Just because we get sick anyway doesn't mean we shouldn't take precautions to keep ourselves healthy. This works as evidence because it is a premise that the arguer is assuming that the audience would accept as something true. So this data is being used to support the following claim. Just because gun violence might still occur doesn't mean we shouldn't try to protect ourselves from it. And the implied warrant that exists that connects the data to the claim is essentially this. Getting sick is to taking healthcare precautions is a similar relationship to gun violence victimization is to gun safety laws. So what we've got here is a comparison between very different things. Getting sick and gun violence are different types of things. Taking safety precautions to keep ourselves healthy is a very different thing than enacting gun safety laws that would keep ourselves safe from gun violence. We're not talking about things that exist within the same classes. So how does this analogy reasoning operate? Let's look at it visually to see how it works. So we have taking health precautions, and we still might get sick. On the other hand, we have taking precautions against gun violence, and we have gun violence still might happen. And so the argument that's being made here is a comparison not between the elements, because the elements are very different from one another. They exist in different classes. But the comparison that's being made is being made on the level of the relationship between the elements. So taking health precautions has a relationship to you still might get sick, and taking precautions against gun violence has a relationship to gun violence still might happen. In this instance, we might characterize the relationship as something like this. Taking the action is a good idea even if the negative outcome happens, because better safe, or in this case, I guess, because better safer than sorry. So the way that the argument operates is, even though gun violence still might happen, it's still a good idea to take precautions against it. This particular argument, as part of the larger gun control debate, is often used as a response to a criticism of calls for gun control that often come from gun rights advocates. The idea is you shouldn't enact these additional laws to make guns harder to get, because gun violence is still going to happen. There are still criminals that are going to get guns illegally, and so it's not going to prevent anything, so we might as well not do it. The argument that supporters of gun control provide in response is, just because gun violence still might happen doesn't mean it's not a good idea to try to take precautions against it. And this particular formulation of the argument uses an analogy in order to support that claim. Just because you still might get sick doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad idea to take a flu shot, or to take your vitamins, or to go see the doctor for a checkup. So this relationship is true in one instance, and it's being compared to another instance. So you can see right away that this is a very different kind of logic than some of the kinds of warrants we've been looking at earlier in this series. This is a kind of logic that is more rhetorical in nature than absolutely logical from an absolute philosophical sense. The analogy is going to be logical to the extent that the audience believes that the relationship between the things that are being compared is one that's sufficiently similar to make sense in this instance. So, what are the tests of reasoning going to be for this kind of argument? First of all, as we know from earlier in this series, we have a test of quality. Do the conditions or relationships being compared share similarities that illustrate a point persuasively? Secondly, we'll have a test of quantity. Are the similarities sufficient to make a well-reasoned comparison? And again, remember, we're talking about similarities in the relationships or the conditions between the element. We're not talking about similarities between the things being presented in the data and the claim, because we already know they're very different. Finally, a test of opposition. Are there important differences between the objects that make the proffered comparison unsound? In the test of opposition, then, we are going to be interested in what kinds of specific objects are involved in these relationships, because we might find that they are so different that the relationship that's being offered really isn't as similar as you might imagine. Let's take it to our example and see how this would work. The test of quality. Do we have some kind of significant similarity in the relationship between the things that are being compared? So, as we pointed out with our visual depiction just a bit earlier, we do have a significant similarity, because in both instances, First, the instance of taking health precautions, such as getting an immunization, or taking your vitamins, or trying to live healthy, or washing your hands. These kinds of things are all a good idea to do, even though you still might get sick, because the worst that can happen is you've made yourself a bit safer, and that's not a bad thing. And in the case of taking precautions against gun violence, for instance, gun safety regulations, doing these kinds of things would presumably be a good idea to do, even though there's the possibility that you still might be victimized by gun violence, because making yourself safer is never a bad thing. There's no downside to making yourself safer. So in this instance, the test of quality seems like it makes sense. Now, as we know from our previous discussions in testing logical warrants, the test of quantity and the test of opposition are often good to look at roughly at the same time, because what we need to do is determine whether there are enough similarities between these relationships and conditions that might outweigh a possible exceptional circumstance. So in both of these instances, we're talking about taking an action that has to do with personal safety and personal health, trying to protect ourselves from harm. In both instances, we're dealing with a negative outcome that we would prefer to avoid. So there's a number of ways in which the objects have a basic similarity to them, and the relationship seems like it makes sense in both instances. However, when we apply the test of opposition, there is a really important exception. And that is, when it comes to taking precautions against gun violence, there are other things that we need to keep in mind besides just keeping ourselves safe. For instance, the Second Amendment to the Constitution, which protects our constitutional right to keep and bear arms. In the current state of constitutional law, that means that American citizens have a right to own personal firearms. And so, taking precautions against gun violence might make ourselves safer, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all of those precautions are going to be a good idea to use. Because it might be that some of those precautions might violate the Second Amendment. If a precaution is unconstitutional, that would be an argument against doing it. Whereas when it comes to taking health precautions, it's really difficult to find examples of circumstances under which taking health precautions would be inadvisable, or where there would be a significant downside or a risk to taking that health precaution. So somebody looking at this argument critically might say, well, from the standpoint of the test of quality, there does seem to be a significant similarity in the relationships between these items that sounds like it makes sense. However, when we apply the test of opposition, there is a significant difference in the latter relationship as opposed to the former relationship. There are significant exceptions that apply when it comes to taking gun safety precautions that don't apply when we're taking health precautions. Okay, so this is a basic example of how an analogy, specifically a figurative analogy, would work. Now, how often do these kinds of arguments actually get used in real-world public arguments? Well, perhaps more often than you might imagine. Since we're talking about a form of reasoning that is perhaps more rhetorical than traditionally logical, it's important to note that figurative analogies often depend on the kind of language that's being used, especially language that is figurative, that might be metaphorical, have some kind of symbolic meaning or significance, that has a lot to do with the language and style in the argument evoking certain kinds of ideas. One public figure in recent history that was a rhetorical master in the use of symbolic metaphors and analogies was former President Ronald Reagan. Throughout his presidency, he used an analogy referring to the United States as a shining city on a hill. And he uses this particular analogy to describe the vision of America that he had and why it was that America under his leadership was successful. Let's take a look at his discussion of this analogy during his farewell address in 1989.
And that's about all I have to say tonight, except for one thing. The past few days, when I've been at that window upstairs, I've thought a bit of the shining city upon a hill. The phrase comes from John Winthrop, who wrote it to describe the America he imagined. What he imagined was important because he was an early pilgrim, an early freedom man. He journeyed here on what today we'd call a little wooden boat. And like the other pilgrims, he was looking for a home that would be free. I've spoken of the shining city all my political life, but I don't know if I ever quite communicated what I saw when I said it. But in my mind, it was a tall, proud city built on rocks stronger than oceans, windswept, God-blessed, and teeming with people of all kinds living in harmony and peace. A city with pretty ports that hummed with commerce and creativity. And if there had to be city walls, the walls had doors, and the doors were open to anyone with the will and the heart to get here. That's how I saw it and see it still. And how stands the city on this winter night? More prosperous, more secure, and happier than it was 8 years ago. But more than that, after 200 years, 2 centuries, she still stands strong and true on the granite ridge, and her glow is held steady, no matter what storm. And she's still a beacon, still a magnet for all who must have freedom, for all the pilgrims from all the lost places who are hurtling through the darkness toward home.
So now that you have a sense of how Reagan used the shining city on a hill analogy in his rhetoric, let's use a Toulmin diagram to break down how this analogy argument works. First of all, we have a claim. The United States is the shining city upon a hill, the source of freedom and opportunity for Americans and the rest of the world. And he provides support for this claim by unpacking John Winthrop's discussion of the city upon a hill in his original public discourse during the days of the Pilgrims. Winthrop's city upon a hill was a vision of an ideal home where pilgrims of the world could have freedom. And so the implicit warrant that links up these ideas is that city on a hill and its relationship to the Pilgrims is a similar relationship than that existing between the United States and the rest of the world. Let's see how this might look in terms of the visual diagram that we used earlier. So first we have Winthrop's original vision. We have the shining city upon a hill, and we have a pilgrim's vision of a free home. And on the other hand, we have the United States of America and the world's best hope for freedom. And so while in a sense what we're doing here is comparing the United States of America to Winthrop's shining city upon a hill, that's not a completely accurate way to think about the logic of this argument, because a city upon a hill is in a very different class of things than an entire nation, the United States of America. What we're actually doing are comparing these relationships. On the one hand, the relationship between the shining city upon a hill and the pilgrims looking for a home where they could have freedom, and the relationship between the United States of America and the world, in terms of the world hoping for a place where freedom is possible. And that relationship might get characterized like this, that the place isn't just a place, but it's an ideal. And that ideal provides opportunity for those who are seeking it. And that opportunity can be experienced by those who are within the city, or within the nation, and from those who are outside of the city or outside of the nation who are coming to it, looking for that freedom and looking for that opportunity. So that's the basis on which this analogic comparison operates. And so we need to think to ourselves, how do we test the warrant? Test of quality. Do the conditions or relationships being compared share similarities that illustrate a point persuasively? Well, what we have in this instance is a relationship that seems like it works in both instances. We have a place, but we have a place that's often seen by others as an ideal. And so that ideal is something that represents certain values, certain desirable goals or outcomes for one's life that folks want to achieve. And so going to that particular ideal place is where those values, where those principles and opportunities for desirable outcomes can be achieved. However, what we need to do is ask ourselves, are there significant differences between those relationships that might call this analogy into question? Now, just looking at the way that Reagan uses this analogy, it doesn't really seem intuitively like there might be a really important exception or difference that might jump out at us. However, if you're familiar with your rhetorical history, you might know that when John Winthrop is talking about the shining city upon a hill back during the days of the Pilgrims, first of all, fun fact, he never used the word shining. He just referred to the new world of the Pilgrims as a city upon a hill. And in that famous sermon where he makes reference to the New World, the place where the Pilgrims are coming, as a city upon a hill, what he's talking about is not actually, as Reagan characterizes it, a place where they could live and enjoy freedom, but in fact, he was talking about a city upon a hill in the respect that, to paraphrase Winthrop, the eyes of the world would be able to look upon them and their experiment to see whether or not what they were trying to achieve as an ideal was something that was even going to work. So Winthrop was actually using the city upon a hill metaphor as a cautionary tale and not necessarily describing this shining ideal of this new Jerusalem that everyone was just going to love as a place where they could enjoy freedom. He was talking about their new experiment in free living as a city upon a hill because everybody was going to be watching them and seeing whether or not it was actually going to work. So Reagan and his speechwriters are actually taking Winthrop's idea and putting a different twist on it. So, in that respect, there's an error in the analogy because it's being misused from its original rhetorical intent. However, that being said, as a tool of rhetorical imagery, the use of the shining city upon a hill to talk about the relationship that the United States might have ideally to the rest of the world who look to us and our values of freedom and opportunity, that's something that rhetorically is rather appealing and folks found very effective back then as well as today. Indeed, subsequent presidents, up to and including Barack Obama and I believe even President Donald Trump, have referred to the shining city upon a hill imagery that Reagan used so famously. However, Reagan's use of the shining city upon a hill analogy to talk about an ideal America was by no means uncontested during his presidency. In 1984, President Reagan was running for re-election, and the Democratic Party were really trying hard to unseat a very popular president. The keynote speaker at the Democratic National Convention in 1984 was New York Governor Mario Cuomo, and he gave a famous piece of political oratory that took this figurative analogy of the United States as the shining city upon a hill, took it on forthright. I want to play for you a portion of that address and then explain how Cuomo is, in effect, critiquing Reagan's use of the analogy by using his own analogy.
10 days ago, President Reagan admitted that although some people in this country seem to be doing well nowadays, others were unhappy, even worried about themselves, their families, and their futures. The president said that he didn't understand that fear. He said, "Why, this country is a shining city on a hill." And the president is right. In many ways, we are a shining city on a hill. But the hard truth is that not everyone is sharing in this city's splendor and glory. A shining city is perhaps all the president sees from the portico of the White House and the veranda of his ranch, where everyone seems to be doing well. But there's another city. There's another part to the shining city. The part where some people can't pay their mortgages, and most young people can't afford one, where students can't afford the education they need, and middle-class parents watch the dreams they hold for their children evaporate. In this part of the city, there are more poor than ever, more families in trouble, more and more people who need help but can't find it. Even worse, there are elderly people who tremble in the basements of the houses there. And there are people who sleep in the city's streets, in the gutter, where the glitter doesn't show. There are ghettos where thousands of young people without a job or an education give their lives away to drug dealers every day. There is despair, Mr. President, in the faces that you don't see, in the places that you don't visit, in your shining city. In fact, Mr. President, this is a nation. Mr. President, you ought to know that this nation is more a tale of two cities than it is just a shining city on a hill.
Okay, so let's use a Toulmin diagram to break down what Cuomo's doing in this part of the address to see how it's working. First of all, we have data, and there's two primary pieces of evidence that he brings up. First of all, that Reagan praises the United States as a free and prosperous city upon a hill, and he's making specific reference to the Republican National Convention speech that Reagan gave just a little while previously when he accepted his nomination for re-election, and he made use of the metaphoric analogy in that speech. The second piece of evidence is that Reagan is ignoring U.S. citizens who are poor and suffering in places throughout the country where he doesn't visit. In this data, then, are the seeds of an analogy that are going to provide the basis for the critical claim that he's going to make. And the analogy essentially works like this in the warrant. The city on a hill has a relationship to Reagan's America in a way that's very similar to the relationship between another city and those in America who suffer. Which leads us to the claim that he makes through analogy reasoning that what we actually have is a tale of two cities, not a shining city on a hill. What's interesting from a symbolic standpoint in this claim is that the phrase "a tale of two cities," some of you literary buffs might be knowing where I'm going with this, is the title of a famous novel by Charles Dickens, set during the French Revolution, where there was a comparison between events that were taking place in London and events taking place in Paris, but more importantly, there were events taking place on the level of the aristocracy and the rich, and then those that were taking place on the level of the working class, the poor, the downtrodden, those that eventually revolted against the aristocracy. So, Tale of Two Cities is evoking that kind of dynamic between the rich and the working poor to establish a contrast that is really, really different than a unified shining city on a hill. Let's break this down with our visual diagram just like we did before. First, we have the following. We have Reagan's shining city upon a hill, and we have a tale of two cities. We've got two competing visions. On the other hand, we have Reagan's America, which Cuomo characterizes as the prosperous and happy and free United States of America that Reagan described during his nomination acceptance address. And then we have the America of those Reagan ignores, in the inner cities, in Appalachia, in those poor and downtrodden areas across the country. And so what's being compared is the relationship between, on the one hand, the shining city upon a hill and a tale of two cities, and on the other hand, Reagan's America and the other America he ignores. And that relationship can be characterized this way, according to Cuomo. There's a contrast between a utopian ideal of freedom and opportunity versus what the real situation is, according to Cuomo, a dystopia of poverty and oppression. So when Reagan's talking about a shining city upon a hill, he is forgetting about the other city. Because the America that Reagan's talking about, the America that is prosperous, that has economic strength, that is happy because they're experiencing freedom and all the things that go along with it, what that is not taking into account is the other America, the impoverished America, the downtrodden and oppressed America. So this analogy between the city upon a hill and a tale of two cities as a way to talk about the relationship between Reagan's America and the other America that hasn't been positively impacted by Reagan's contributions, he's using this analogic argument in a way to apply the test of opposition to Reagan's original analogy. What he's saying is that Reagan's analogy of using the shining city upon a hill to talk about what America is to its citizens and the rest of the world actually doesn't pass the test of opposition because there are important exceptional circumstances. Not everybody within the city is actually shining, right? Not everybody is prosperous. Not everybody is experiencing the fruits of freedom. So when we're talking about figurative analogies, in many ways, the tests of quality, quantity, and opposition are going to be operating exactly the same way as they might when we're talking about evaluating a warrant of parallel case. However, the real important distinction is, particularly for the tests of quality and quantity, what we're discussing is the conditions or relationships that are being compared. Do the conditions or relationships that are being compared share similarities that illustrate a point persuasively? And do we have enough similarities in those relationships to make a well-reasoned comparison? We are not comparing the objects because the objects exist in different classes. But what we're comparing are the relationships or other conditions in this contrast between very different things to see whether or not they're sufficiently similar to make a point that from the audience's standpoint are premises that seem to make reasonable sense. On the other hand, the test of opposition is going to ask, are there important differences in those relationships or even in the objects themselves that make the proffered comparison unsound? If the relationship that's being constructed is being constructed by pairs of objects that are so dissimilar that the relationship really doesn't make sense, then the analogy isn't going to be reasonable. And you can see, as we wrap up this discussion of substantive warrants from the Toulmin standpoint, what's important to think about is that this is logic that operates not solely on some kind of absolute relationship between premises in an argument with structured validity. We're talking about the messiness of real human argument. And ultimately, whether or not these kinds of warrants, especially a warrant like figurative analogy, is going to be deemed reasonable or not is going to depend on the audience and what the audience is bringing to the table with regard to what they presume to be correct, sound, reasonable, something that makes sense from their experience and their sense of reason. Okay, that concludes our discussion of argument prototypes. If you have any questions about any of the prototypes we've discussed in the series, or especially about figurative analogy and how it contrasts against parallel case, for instance, please don't hesitate to let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.